Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a complete journey through the rise and fall of England's most ruthless dynasty, from 1154 to 1485. These powerful monarchs forged an empire that stretched across Europe, waged the 100 Years' War, and ultimately tore themselves apart in the bloody Wars of the Roses. We'll softly explore the conquests of Henry II and the creation of the Angevin Empire, the legendary crusades of Richard the Lionheart, the tyranny that led to Magna Carta under King John, the military brilliance of Edward III, and the family betrayals that led to their ultimate destruction. Across more than 3 centuries, we'll witness how ambition, cruelty, and royal blood created and destroyed the most fascinating dynasty in English history. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which Plantagenet king you find most fascinating, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So, cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from medieval England lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Henry, later known as King Henry II of England and founder of the Plantagenet dynasty, was born on March 5, 1133, at Le Mans in the county of Maine, during one of the most turbulent periods in medieval European history. His birth came at a time when England was being torn apart by civil war. France was fragmenting into competing duchies, and the very concept of centralized royal authority seemed to be dissolving into chaos. The young prince's parentage destined him for greatness, though few could have predicted the extraordinary empire he would forge. His father, Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, was renowned throughout France for his military prowess and administrative skill. Geoffrey had earned his nickname Plantagenet from his habit of wearing a sprig of yellow broom flower planta, genista in Latin, in his cap, a botanical emblem that would eventually give its name to England's greatest royal dynasty. Geoffrey's marriage to Matilda, daughter of Henry I of England and widow of Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, represented one of the most ambitious political alliances of the 12th century. Matilda herself was a remarkable woman, the first female claimant to the English throne. She possessed an intelligence and determination that would be passed down to her famous son. Her struggles to claim her rightful inheritance from her cousin, Stephen of Blois, had plunged England into the anarchic civil war known to history as the Anarchy. Young Henry spent his earliest years surrounded by the sounds of war and political intrigue. The great castles of Maine and Anjou echoed with the discussions of military strategy, diplomatic negotiations, and the constant planning required to maintain Geoffrey's expanding territories. From his father, Henry learned the art of siege warfare, the importance of controlling key river crossings, and the administrative skills necessary to govern diverse populations. Speaking different languages and following different customs, his education was remarkable for its breadth and sophistication. Unlike many medieval nobles who focused solely on military training, Henry was taught to read and write in Latin, Norman French, and the emerging vernacular languages of his territories. He studied the works of classical authors, particularly Vegetius's military treatises, and the historical writings of Caesar and Livy. More importantly, he was schooled in the practical arts of governance, how to assess tax revenues, negotiate with merchants, and balance the competing demands of church and secular authorities. The young prince's physical development matched his intellectual growth. Contemporary chroniclers described Henry as possessing a robust, stocky build that spoke of both royal breeding and warrior strength. His most striking feature was his piercing grey eyes, which seemed to look right through people and earned him a reputation for being able to detect lies and deception with unsettling accuracy. His reddish-brown hair and ruddy complexion marked him clearly as a child of the northern French nobility, while his restless energy became legendary courtiers noted that Henry never seemed to sit still, always pacing, always thinking, always planning his next move. The path to power opened dramatically when Henry reached his 14th birthday. Stephen's reign in England had proven to be a disaster of epic proportions. The kingdom that Henry I had left prosperous and well-governed had descended into chaos, with rival barons building unauthorized castles, creating their own currencies, and waging private wars that devastated the countryside. Trade had collapsed, royal revenues had dwindled to almost nothing, and large portions of northern England had effectively become independent kingdoms under Scottish control. In 1147, Henry made his first attempt to claim his inheritance, landing in England with a small force of Angevin knights and mercenaries. Though this initial expedition failed due to lack of preparation and insufficient local support, it demonstrated the young prince's remarkable courage and his unwavering belief in his destiny. More importantly, it gave him first-hand experience of English conditions and allowed him to build relationships with nobles who had remained secretly loyal to his mother's cause. The real opportunity came in 1153, when Henry launched a carefully planned invasion with substantial forces supplied by his father and supported by a network of English allies who had grown disgusted with Stephen's incompetent rule. This campaign showcased Henry's emerging genius for military organization and political calculation. Rather than attempting to conquer England through brute force, he conducted a systematic campaign designed to demonstrate royal authority while avoiding the kind of devastating warfare that had made Stephen so unpopular. Henry's strategy was masterful. In its sophistication, he coordinated his military movements with diplomatic overtures to wavering nobles, offering pardons and confirmations of land grants to those who submitted while threatening complete destruction for those who continued to resist. His forces captured key strategic points, important river crossings, major roads, and fortified towns while avoiding unnecessary bloodshed that might turn public opinion against him. The young prince's understanding of medieval warfare proved remarkably advanced. Unlike traditional military commanders who focused on dramatic castle sieges and pitched battles, Henry emphasized the importance of logistics, communications, and maintaining popular support. His army was better supplied and more disciplined than Stephen's forces, while his ability to coordinate simultaneous operations across multiple regions demonstrated a strategic sophistication that amazed contemporary observers. The decisive moment came at the siege of Wallingford Castle, where Henry's forces successfully relieved the fortress, while Stephen's army watched helplessly from the opposite bank of the Thames. This military success was immediately followed by political triumph when Stephen's heir Eustace died suddenly, removing the primary obstacle to a negotiated settlement. The Treaty of Wallingford that followed represented one of the most important diplomatic agreements in English history, establishing Henry as Stephen's heir, while allowing the old king to retain his crown for his remaining lifetime. Stephen's death in October 1154 brought Henry peacefully to the English throne, but his inheritance extended far beyond England's borders. Through his father Geoffrey, he controlled the counties of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine in the heart of France. Through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the brilliant, tempestuous former Queen of Francie had gained control of vast territories, stretching from the Loire Valley to the Pyrenees Mountains. This created what historians would later call the Angevin Empire, a collection of territories that made Henry the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. Eleanor herself deserves special attention, for she was perhaps the most remarkable woman of the 12th century and would prove to be Henry's equal in intelligence, ambition, and political skill. Born around 1122, Eleanor had inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine as a teenager, making her one of the wealthiest and most powerful nobles in France. Her first marriage to Louis VII of France had lasted 15 years, but had been annulled due to their failure to produce male heirs and Eleanor's increasingly independent behavior, which scandalized the French court. The marriage between Henry and Eleanor in May 1152 represented both a passionate love match and a calculated political alliance. Eleanor brought not only immense wealth, but also a sophisticated court culture that would transform the Angevin territories into centers of learning, poetry, and artistic achievement. Her patronage of troubadours and poets helped create the literary traditions of courtly love and chivalric romance that would influence European culture for centuries. The early years of Henry's reign were consumed with the enormous task of rebuilding royal authority throughout his territories. In England, he faced the challenge of restoring central government after nearly 20 years of civil war. Hundreds of unauthorized castles had been built during Stephen's reign, creating independent power bases for rebellious barons. Henry approached this problem systematically, negotiating the surrender of some fortifications while besieging and destroying others, gradually re-establishing the royal monopoly on castle building that was essential to medieval governance. The administrative reforms Henry implemented in England were revolutionary in their scope and sophistication. He rebuilt the royal treasury, re-established the collection of traditional revenues, and created new sources of income through judicial fees and administrative charges. More importantly, he revolutionized the English legal system by establishing royal courts, with jurisdiction over matters that had previously been handled by local nobles or church authorities. Henry's legal innovations would prove to be his most lasting legacy. The system of royal justices travelling on circuit throughout England created the foundation of English common law, establishing uniformed legal procedures and precedents that would influence legal development not only in England, but throughout the English-speaking world. His reforms included the establishment of standardized legal documents that allowed ordinary people to seek justice in royal courts, and the creation of jury systems that involved local communities in the administration of justice. But governing the Angevin Empire required constant travel and enormous energy. Unlike modern nations with unified legal systems and efficient communication networks, Henry's territories were a patchwork of different customs, languages, and legal traditions. The Duchy of Normandy followed Norman law and custom, while Aquitaine retained its own distinctive legal procedures developed over centuries of relative independence. Anjou and Maine had their own administrative structures, and England was attempting to rebuild institutions shattered by decades of civil war. Henry's response to these challenges demonstrated his extraordinary capabilities as both a military commander and an administrator. He spent his reign in constant motion, traveling from territory to dispense justice, quell rebellions, and manage the complex web of feudal obligations that held his empire together. Contemporary chroniclers marveled at his energy. One observer noted that Henry seemed to need no sleep and could cover enormous distances on horseback while continuing to conduct business and make important decisions. The king's court became a mobile center of government and culture, moving constantly throughout the Angevin territories and attracting scholars, poets, administrators, and ambitious nobles from throughout Europe. Henry's intellectual curiosity was remarkable. He spoke multiple languages fluently, patronized scholars and writers, and maintained extensive correspondence with learned men throughout Christendom. His court became a center for the translation of classical texts and the development of vernacular literature. Henry's relationship with Eleanor produced 8 children, creating a large royal family that would dominate European politics for generations. Their eldest surviving son, Henry the young king, was crowned as heir apparent in 1170, following Capetian precedent in associating his successor with royal authority during his own lifetime. Richard, their second surviving son, was groomed to inherit Aquitaine, while Geoffrey was designated as the future Duke of Brittany. The youngest son, John, was initially without a clear inheritance, earning him the nickname Lackland. The royal children received the finest education available in medieval Europe, studying with renowned scholars and learning the skills necessary for governing vast territories. But their upbringing also exposed them to the tensions and contradictions inherent in Henry's empire building. Each son was encouraged to develop loyalty to his designated territory, creating potential conflicts of interest that would later tear the family apart. Henry's greatest crisis came from an unexpected source: his former friend and chancellor, Thomas Becket. When the Archbishop of Canterbury died in 1162, Henry appointed Becket to the position, expecting his loyal ally to help bring the powerful English Church under royal control. This decision would prove to be one of the most fateful in English history, transforming a trusted advisor into a bitter enemy and creating a conflict that would overshadow much of Henry's reign. Becket's transformation from worldly chancellor to ascetic archbishop was as sudden as it was complete. The man who had lived in luxury, hunting with the king and managing royal business with efficient pragmatism, suddenly adopted a hair shirt, embraced voluntary poverty, and began aggressively defending church privileges against royal encroachment. Henry was both bewildered and enraged by this change, seeing it as a personal betrayal by someone he had trusted completely. The conflict between Henry and Becket centered on fundamental questions about the relationship between church and state. In medieval society, Henry sought to bring clerics accused of serious crimes under the jurisdiction of royal courts, arguing that church courts were too lenient and allowed criminal clergy to escape proper punishment. Becket insisted that such cases fell exclusively under church jurisdiction and that any attempt to subject clergy to secular courts violated divine law. The dispute escalated through a series of increasingly bitter confrontations. At the Council of Woodstock in 1163, Henry demanded that Becket accept the principle of dual jurisdiction, allowing royal courts to try clerics accused of secular crimes. Becket's refusal led to the Constitution of Clarendon in 1164, where Henry attempted to codify the relationship between church and state in England. When Becket initially agreed to these constitutions under pressure but then repudiated his acceptance, the conflict became irreconcilable. Becket's flight to France in November 1164 transformed a domestic English dispute into an international crisis. The archbishops sought support from Pope Alexander III and King Louis VII of France, both of whom saw an opportunity to embarrass and weaken Henry. For 6 years, Becket remained in exile while Henry faced the threat of excommunication and papal interdict, punishments that could have undermined his authority throughout Christendom. The conflict devastated Henry personally and politically. His attempts to negotiate a settlement were repeatedly frustrated by Becket's intransigence and the Pope's reluctance to abandon a martyr to church independence. Henry's coronation of his son as co-king in 1170, performed by the Archbishop of York rather than Canterbury, represented both a practical necessity and a deliberate insult to Becket's authority. The temporary reconciliation between Henry and Becket in 1170 satisfied no one and resolved nothing. Becket's return to England was marked by his excommunication of bishops who had participated in the young king's coronation, demonstrating that his opposition to royal authority remained uncompromised. The crisis reached its tragic climax on December 29, 1170, when 4 knights, apparently acting on their interpretation of Henry's angry words, murdered Becket at the altar of Canterbury Cathedral. The assassination sent shockwaves throughout medieval Europe. Becket was immediately venerated as a martyr, and miracles were reported at his tomb within days of his death. Henry faced not only moral condemnation, but also the practical consequences of being associated with the murder of an archbishop. He was forced to perform public penance, walking barefoot to Canterbury Cathedral, where he was ritually whipped by monks, demonstrating his submission to church authority. Yet Henry's reign encompassed far more than his conflict with Becket. His conquest of Ireland in 1171 to 1172 extended Angevin authority into territories that had never been effectively controlled by any external power. The Norman invasion of Ireland, initially led by Richard the Clare and other Anglo-Norman adventurers, was systematized and legitimized by Henry's personal intervention. He established a colonial administration that would influence Irish development for centuries. The Irish expedition demonstrated Henry's ability to adapt his governing methods to entirely different cultural and political circumstances. Ireland's clan-based society and pastoral economy required different approaches than the feudalized territories of France or the emerging urban centers of England. Henry's establishment of fortified towns, introduction of English legal procedures, and encouragement of Norman settlement created the foundation for the Anglo-Norman lordship of Ireland. Henry's relationship with Scotland and Wales showcased his sophisticated understanding of medieval diplomacy and warfare. Rather than attempting immediate conquest of these territories, he pursued policies of gradual integration and influence. His marriage alliances with Scottish and Welsh rulers, combined with military pressure and diplomatic negotiation, extended Angevin influence without the massive military expenditures that outright conquest would have required. The king's administrative innovations extended beyond legal reform to include fundamental changes in royal finance and military organization. He systematized the collection of feudal revenues, standardized currency and weights and measures, and created new administrative positions to manage his growing bureaucracy. His military reforms included the development of professional siege engineers, the standardization of equipment and training, and the creation of supply systems that could support extended campaigns. Henry's patronage of learning and culture helped create the intellectual foundation for what historians would later call the 12th century Renaissance. His court attracted scholars from throughout Europe, including John of Salisbury, Gerald of Wales, and Walter Map, whose writings provide invaluable insights into medieval thought and culture. The historical chronicles produced during Henry's reign, particularly those of Roger of Howden and Ralph de Cito, represent some of the finest historical writing of the medieval period. The later years of Henry's reign were increasingly overshadowed by family conflicts that would ultimately destroy much of what he had built. The young king's rebellion in 1173, supported by Eleanor and his brothers Richard and Geoffrey, represented both a personal betrayal and a fundamental challenge to Henry's imperial structure. The rebellion was encouraged by Louis VII of France, who saw an opportunity to fragment the Angevin Empire by exploiting its internal contradictions. The Great Revolt of 1173 to 1174 tested every aspect of Henry's leadership, facing simultaneous rebellions in England, Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. He demonstrated remarkable strategic skills in coordinating the defense of his scattered territories. His victory was achieved through a combination of military excellence, political astuteness, and sheer determination that impressed even his enemies. Henry's reconciliation with his family after the revolt appeared to restore harmony, but the underlying tensions remained unresolved. The young king's death in 1183 eliminated the immediate threat of succession dispute, but created new problems as Richard and Geoffrey maneuvered for position as Henry's heir. Eleanor's continued imprisonment, while necessary for political stability, created lasting resentment that would influence future family relationships. The final crisis of Henry's reign came with Richard's alliance with Philip Augustus of France in 1189. This partnership between Henry's son and his greatest enemy represented the ultimate failure of the imperial project. The very size and complexity of the Angevin Empire had created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by ambitious rivals. Henry's defeat at the Battle of Balance and his humiliating submission to Philip and Richard marked the effective end of his personal authority. Henry's death on July 6, 1189, at Chinon Castle in Anjou brought to an end one of the most remarkable reigns in medieval history. He had transformed a collection of disparate territories into the most powerful empire in Western Europe, created legal and administrative institutions that would influence development for centuries, and established the Plantagenet dynasty as a major force in European politics. Yet Henry's achievements contained the seeds of future disasters. The very success of his empire building created commitments and expectations that his successors would struggle to maintain. His legal reforms, while revolutionary, established precedents for limiting royal authority that would eventually constrain future monarchs. Most importantly, his family conflicts demonstrated the inherent instability of medieval empires based on personal relationships rather than institutional structures. The legacy of Henry II extended far beyond his immediate political achievements. His legal innovations laid the foundation for the English common law system that would eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world. His administrative reforms created the bureaucratic structures that enabled medieval England to develop into a major European power. His cultural patronage helped establish traditions of learning and artistic achievement that would flourish for centuries. Henry Plantagenet died believing he had established an empire that would endure for generations. Instead, he had created the political and institutional framework for developments that would transform not only England, but much of the world. The restless energy, intellectual curiosity, and ruthless ambition that characterized his reign would be inherited by his successors, though few would combine these qualities as effectively as the founder of the Plantagenet dynasty. Richard, later known as Richard the Lionheart, Richard the Lion, and the most legendary of all English kings, was born on September 8, 1157, at Beaumont Palace in Oxford. During a brief, peaceful moment in his parents' tempestuous relationship, from his earliest days, Richard seemed destined for a life of adventure and warfare that would make him the very embodiment of medieval chivalry and crusading zeal. As the third son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard was never expected to inherit the English throne, a circumstance that profoundly shaped his character and ambitions. Unlike his elder brother Henry, the young king, who was groomed for royal responsibility from childhood, Richard was educated to be a territorial prince, focusing on the military and administrative skills necessary to govern Aquitaine, his mother's vast duchy in southwestern France. The young prince's upbringing was remarkable for its sophistication and cultural diversity. Eleanor's court in Poitiers had become the center of troubadour culture and courtly romance, attracting poets, musicians, and scholars from throughout Europe. Richard grew up surrounded by the literature of chivalric adventure, the music of wandering minstrels, and the complex political intrigue that characterized one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated courts. Richard's physical development matched the heroic ideals celebrated in contemporary literature. He grew to exceptional height for his era. Contemporary sources suggest he stood well over 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and powerful build of a warrior. His hair was described as being between red and gold, while his piercing blue eyes and commanding presence made him instantly recognizable in any gathering. More importantly, he possessed the physical courage and martial skills that medieval society valued above all other qualities in its leaders. From his earliest youth, Richard demonstrated an aptitude for military command that amazed even his experienced contemporaries. At age 14, he was already leading armies against rebellious barons in Poitou, displaying a tactical sophistication and ruthless efficiency that would characterize his entire career. His first independent military campaigns revealed not only natural talent but also careful study of contemporary military theory and siege warfare techniques. The young duke's education extended far beyond military matters. Like his father, Richard was literate in multiple languages, including Latin, Norman French, and the Occitan dialect of his Aquitanian subjects. He composed poetry in the troubadour tradition, with several of his works surviving to demonstrate considerable literary skill. His cultural interests and patronage of artists would make his court one of medieval Europe's most brilliant centers of learning and artistic achievement. Richard's assumption of effective control over Aquitaine in 1172 marked the beginning of his transformation from promising prince to legendary warrior. The duchy he inherited was vast but fragmented, controlled by numerous semi-independent barons who had grown accustomed to virtual autonomy during the previous decades of conflict. Richard's systematic campaign to establish ducal authority demonstrated both his military genius and his understanding of the political realities of feudal governance. The conquest of Tailbourg Castle in 1179 established Richard's reputation as one of Europe's most formidable military commanders. The fortress was considered virtually impregnable, protected by natural cliffs on 3 sides and massive fortifications on the 4th. Richard's victory was achieved through innovative siege techniques, psychological warfare, and the kind of personal courage that inspired absolute devotion among his followers. Contemporary chroniclers described the siege in terms that seem almost mythical. Richard personally led the assault on the castle walls, fighting with a sword in one hand and a crossbow in the other, while arrows and stones rained down around him. When the garrison attempted to sally forth to break the siege, Richard rallied his forces through personal example, cutting down enemy knights with apparently supernatural skill. The fall of Tailbourg in just 2 days shocked medieval Europe and established Richard as heir to the military tradition of his Plantagenet ancestors. The young duke's methods of warfare were as revolutionary as they were effective. Unlike traditional medieval commanders who relied primarily on cavalry charges and formal sieges, Richard emphasized combined arms, tactics, innovative engineering, and psychological warfare designed to break enemy morale. His armies included not only knights and men-at-arms, but also professional engineers, crossbowmen from Italy and Genoa, and specialists in various forms of siege warfare. Richard's conquest of Aquitaine involved not merely military victory, but also the systematic establishment of administrative and legal institutions designed to prevent future rebellions. He rebuilt fortifications using the latest military architecture, established new towns to serve as centers of ducal authority, and created legal systems that balanced local customs with centralized control. His success in pacifying one of Europe's most turbulent regions demonstrated abilities that extended far beyond simple military competence. The prince's relationship with his family was complex and often troubled, reflecting the broader tensions within the Angevin Empire. His participation in the Great Revolt of 1173 to 1174, alongside his mother, Eleanor, and brothers, revealed both his loyalty to family and his willingness to challenge authority when he believed his interests were threatened. Though the rebellion failed and resulted in Eleanor's long imprisonment, It demonstrated Richard's early understanding of the political possibilities created by the empire's inherent instabilities. Richard's increasing alliance with Philip Augustus of France in the 1180s represented both personal ambition and shrewd political calculation. As Henry II aged and became increasingly isolated from his sons, Richard recognized that his inheritance was not guaranteed, and that alternative alliances might prove necessary. His partnership with Philip, sealed by their joint participation in tournaments and diplomatic ceremonies, created a relationship that would profoundly influence the future of both England and France. The news of Jerusalem's fall to Saladin in 1187 transformed Richard from a successful territorial prince into a crusading hero whose legend would endure for centuries. His immediate decision to take the cross reflected not only genuine religious devotion, but also recognition that the crusade offered opportunities for military glory and territorial expansion that could not be found in European conflicts. Unlike many nobles who took crusading vows primarily for political advantage, Richard demonstrated absolute commitment to the enterprise. Richard's preparation for the Third Crusade was methodical and remarkably sophisticated. He understood that success in the Holy Land would require enormous resources, innovative military techniques, and careful logistical planning. His fundraising efforts included not only traditional feudal levies, but also new forms of taxation, the sale of offices and privileges, and borrowing from Italian merchant banks. The sums he raised were unprecedented in English history, demonstrating both the kingdom's growing wealth and Richard's determination to succeed. The military preparations were equally impressive. Richard recruited soldiers from throughout Europe, including English longbowmen, Norman cavalry, Italian crossbowmen, and siege engineers from various regions known for their technical expertise. He commissioned the construction of specialized siege engines, organized supply trains capable of operating across vast distances, and established communication systems that would allow coordination between different crusading armies. Richard's coronation as King of England on September 3, 1189, was overshadowed by his crusading preparations and his obvious intention to use English resources primarily for his Holy Land campaign. The anti-Jewish riots that marred his coronation revealed both the religious fanaticism that characterized the crusading movement and Richard's limited ability to control the darker impulses of his Christian subjects. The new king's brief presence in England before departing on crusade demonstrated his essentially continental perspective and his view of England primarily as a source of revenue for his greater enterprises. Unlike his father, who had seen England as the foundation of Angevin power, Richard regarded his island kingdom as valuable mainly for its ability to finance his military adventures. This attitude would have profound consequences for English political development during his absence. Richard's departure for the Crusade in the summer of 1190 marked the beginning of the most famous military expedition of the medieval period. His decision to travel by sea rather than over land reflected both practical considerations about moving large forces and his recognition that naval control would be essential for maintaining communications with England and ensuring adequate supplies for his army. The conquest of Sicily in 1190-1191 demonstrated Richard's strategic acumen and his understanding that successful crusading required secure bases and reliable allies. His conflict with Tancred of Sicily was ostensibly about securing his sister Joan's inheritance, but the real issue was establishing English influence in the central Mediterranean. Richard's capture of Messina and his subsequent negotiations with Tancred created the foundation for his later success in the Holy Land. The dramatic conquest of Cyprus in 1191 represented perhaps Richard's greatest strategic achievement. The Ireland's position made it the key to naval control of the eastern Mediterranean, while its wealth would help finance his subsequent campaigns. Richard's defeat of Isaac Comnenus, the Byzantine usurper who ruled Cyprus, was accomplished with characteristic speed and efficiency, demonstrating his ability to adapt quickly to new military and political circumstances. The Cyprus campaign also revealed Richard's capacity for both military brilliance and ruthless pragmatism. His treatment of Isaac Comnenus, silver chains because Richard had promised not to put him in iron, showed the kind of literal interpretation of agreements that would characterize his diplomatic negotiations throughout the Crusade. His establishment of a feudal kingdom in Cyprus created a permanent Christian foothold in the eastern Mediterranean that would endure for centuries. Richard's marriage to Berengaria of Navarre at Limassol in May 1191 represented both personal choice and strategic calculation. The alliance with Navarre secured his southern borders in France, while providing additional resources for his crusading activities. The ceremony itself, conducted with magnificent pageantry in the chapel of St. George, demonstrated Richard's understanding of the importance of royal ceremonial in maintaining morale and projecting power. The Third Crusade's arrival in the Holy Land marked the climax of Richard's military career and the achievement of his deepest ambitions. The siege of Acre, which had dragged on for nearly 2 years, was transformed by Richard's arrival and his innovative siege techniques. His construction of new siege engines, his coordination of naval and land forces, and his personal leadership in the assault finally brought about the city's surrender in July 1191. Richard's controversial execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners after the fall of Acre demonstrated the darker side of his character and the ruthless pragmatism that characterized medieval warfare. While some historians have condemned this act as unnecessary cruelty, others have argued that it reflected Richard's understanding that he could not afford to detach forces to guard prisoners while preparing for his advance on Jerusalem. The massacre certainly demonstrated to Saladin and his forces that Richard was prepared to use any means necessary to achieve his objectives. The subsequent campaign that led to the Battle of Arsif on September 7th, 1191, showcased Richard's tactical genius and his ability to maintain discipline under the most challenging circumstances. Saladin's strategy was to harass the crusading army during its march down the Palestinian coast, hoping to break its formation and destroy it piecemeal. Richard's response demonstrated both his understanding of Muslim tactics and his confidence in his own forces. The Battle of Arsif itself has been studied by military historians as one of the finest examples of medieval tactical warfare. Richard's ability to maintain his army's defensive formation while under constant attack, his timing of the counterattack that broke Saladin's forces, and his personal leadership throughout the engagement demonstrated skills that placed him among history's greatest military commanders. Yet the ultimate goal of the crusade, the recapture of Jerusalem, beyond even Richard's considerable abilities. His 2 advances toward the Holy City in late 1191 and again in 1192 were halted not by military defeat, but by the practical impossibility of holding Jerusalem, even if it could be captured. Unlike the romantic legends that would later surround his name, Richard proved himself a realist who understood that conquest without the ability to maintain control was meaningless. The relationship that developed between Richard and Saladin during the Crusade has fascinated historians and popular imagination for centuries. Despite being enemies committed to each other's destruction, the 2 leaders developed a mutual respect that bordered on friendship. Their exchanges of gifts, their chivalrous gestures, and their negotiations revealed both men as sophisticated politicians who understood that honor and pragmatism need not be incompatible. The Treaty of Jaffa that concluded the Third Crusade in September 1192 represented a negotiated compromise that satisfied neither side completely but recognized the military realities both leaders faced. Richard's agreement to a 3-year truce, his acceptance of Saladin's continued control over Jerusalem, and his negotiation of Christian pilgrimage rights demonstrated his understanding that partial success was preferable to continued warfare that might result in complete failure. Richard's departure from the Holy Land in October 1192 marked the end of his crusading career, but the beginning of new adventures that would add to his legendary status. His decision to travel home through Central Europe, while dangerous, was motivated by urgency to return to his territories, which were being threatened by Philip Augustus and his own brother John. The dramatic capture of Richard by Leopold of Austria near Vienna in December 1192 transformed the returning crusader into an international prisoner whose fate would influence European politics for years. Leopold's motivation was partly personal revenge for Richard's humiliation of him at Acre, but primarily political, reflecting the complex alliances and enmities that characterized medieval European diplomacy. Richard's transfer to the custody of Emperor Henry VI represented an escalation of his captivity from personal revenge to international politics. Henry's enormous ransom demand 150,000 marks, equivalent to several times England's annual royal revenue, was designed not only to enrich the imperial treasury, but also to bankrupt England and weaken the Angevin Empire permanently. The period of Richard's captivity revealed both his personal character and his kingdom's loyalty. His composition of poetry expressing his feelings of abandonment, his attempts to negotiate his own release, and his refusal to show deference to his captors, demonstrated the complex personality behind the legendary warrior king. Meanwhile, Eleanor of Aquitaine's heroic efforts to raise his ransom, supported by the unprecedented taxation of both church and secular wealth, showed the depth of English commitment to their absent king. Richard's release in February 1194 was greeted with celebration throughout the Angevin territories, but his remaining years were consumed by warfare against Philip Augustus that demonstrated both his continued military brilliance and the impossible strategic situation he faced. The French king had used Richard's absence to capture much of Normandy, while John's treacherous alliances had weakened English positions throughout France. The construction of Chateau Galliard between 1196 and 1198 represented both Richard's military genius and his understanding of the new realities of medieval warfare. The castle's innovative design, incorporating lessons learned from his experiences in the Holy Land, created what many historians consider the finest example of medieval military architecture. Its position on the Seine protected the approaches to Rouen while serving as a base for Richard's counteroffensives. Richard's final campaign in the Limousin in 1199 demonstrated his continued commitment to aggressive warfare and his belief that military pressure was the key to recovering his lost territories. The siege of Chalais-Chabrol, while minor in strategic terms, was typical of his methodical approach to reducing enemy strongholds and establishing control over contested territories. The circumstances of Richard's death on April 6, 1199, have become legendary, though the details remain disputed by historians. The crossbow bolt that struck him during the siege of Chalais-Chabrol was fired by a defender whose identity and motivation vary according to different chroniclers. Some sources identify him as Pierre Bozel, a knight defending his lord's castle. Others suggest he was a young man seeking revenge for family members killed in Richard's campaigns. What seems certain is that Richard's response to his mortal wound demonstrated the chivalric ideals that had made him legendary. His forgiveness of the crossbowman, his gift of money to the man who had killed him, and his final confession revealed a complex character capable of both ruthless violence and genuine magnanimity. His death in his mother Eleanor's arms at Chinon Castle marked the end of one of the most remarkable lives in medieval history. Richard's instructions for the disposal of his body reflected his understanding of his own symbolic importance and his continued identification with his various territories. His heart was buried at Rouen in Normandy, his entrails at Challis where he died, and his body at Fontevraud Abbey beside his father, creating a physical distribution that symbolized the geographic scope of his life and interests. The immediate consequences of Richard's death were catastrophic for the Angevin Empire. His failure to produce legitimate heirs created a succession crisis that Philip Augustus was perfectly positioned to exploit. The choice between John and young Arthur of Brittany divided the Angevin territories and provided the French king with the opportunity he had long sought to dismember Henry II's empire. Richard's legacy was complex and often contradictory. As a military commander, he ranked among history's greatest generals, demonstrating tactical genius, personal courage, and the ability to inspire absolute devotion among his followers. His crusading activities had enhanced Christian positions in the Holy Land while establishing him as the premier warrior of his generation. His architectural and engineering innovations, particularly visible in Château Galord, influenced military development throughout Europe. Yet Richard's achievements came at enormous cost. His constant warfare had drained English resources, while his absence from his kingdom for most of his reign had weakened royal authority and allowed local nobles to increase their independence. His treatment of England primarily as a source of revenue for his continental adventures established patterns that would contribute to future conflicts between crown and nobility. The transformation of Richard Pern into a legendary figure began almost immediately after his death. Contemporary chroniclers, both Christian and Muslim, praised his military prowess and chivalric behavior. The development of Arthurian romance and crusading literature in the decades following his death drew heavily on his example. While popular ballads and songs spread his fame throughout Europe, Richard's association with the Robin Hood legends, though historically anachronistic, reflected his continued hold on popular imagination. The contrast between the absent but heroic Richard and the evil usurper John provided a perfect framework for stories of resistance to tyranny and hope for eventual justice. These legends, while bearing little relationship to historical reality, demonstrated the enduring appeal of Richard's combination of military prowess and romantic idealism. The transformation of Richard from historical figure to literary hero was facilitated by the genuine achievements of his life and the dramatic circumstances of his death. Unlike many medieval kings whose reputations were created primarily by court chroniclers, Richard's legend was based on real military victories, documented acts of personal courage, and the testimony of both allies and enemies who had witnessed his abilities firsthand. Modern historical evaluation of Richard has been more critical, focusing on his neglect of England, his expensive military adventures, and his failure to provide for a stable succession. Historians have noted that his achievements, while personally impressive, did little to strengthen the long-term position of the Angevin Empire, and may have actually hastened its eventual collapse. Yet this criticism perhaps misses the essential point about Richard's historical significance. He lived in an age when personal prowess and military glory were considered the highest virtues a king could possess. By these standards, Richard was supremely successful, achieving a level of fame and respect that few medieval rulers could match. His influence on contemporary and later concepts of kingship, chivalry, and crusading was profound and lasting. Richard Coeur de Lion died, believing he had lived up to the highest ideals of his age. His crusading activities had served God and enhanced Christian power in the Holy Land. His military victories had demonstrated English prowess and Plantagenet strength. His chivalric behavior had earned the respect of allies and enemies alike. If he had failed to provide for a stable succession or to consolidate his territorial gains, these failures seemed less important than his success in achieving immortal glory. The Lionheart's death marked the end of the crusading age's greatest hero and the beginning of a new chapter in Plantagenet history. His brother John would inherit not only the crown, but also the impossible task of maintaining an empire that Richard's adventures had both glorified and weakened. The legend of Richard the Lionheart would endure long after the Angevin Empire had crumbled, inspiring countless generations with its vision of royal heroism and chivalric excellence. John, later known as John Lachlan, John Softsword, and ultimately as one of England's most despised monarchs, was born on Christmas Eve 1166 at Beaumont Palace in Oxford, during a brief moment of family harmony that would prove all too rare in the turbulent Plantagenet household. As the youngest of Henry II's legitimate sons, John seemed destined for the subordinate role that his nickname, Lachlan, suggested, a landless prince dependent on his father's generosity and his brother's goodwill. The circumstances of John's birth and early childhood profoundly shaped his character and worldview. Unlike his elder brothers, who had been assigned specific territories and roles from early youth, John grew up without clear expectations or defined responsibilities. This uncertainty created a personality marked by suspicion, opportunism, and an almost pathological need to accumulate power and wealth as protection against future dispossession. Contemporary descriptions of John present a striking contrast to his tall, golden-haired brother, Richard. John was short and stocky, with dark hair and eyes that chroniclers described as cruel and calculating. His physical presence lacked the commanding authority that medieval society expected from its rulers, forcing him to rely on cunning, manipulation, and fear rather than natural charisma to maintain his position. John's education was comprehensive and sophisticated, reflecting Henry II's belief that all his sons should be prepared for roles in governing the Angevin Empire. Like his brothers, John learnt to read and write in Latin and Norman French, studied military tactics and siege warfare, and received instruction in the complex legal and administrative procedures necessary for medieval governance. His intellectual abilities were considerable. He possessed a quick wit, an excellent memory, and genuine administrative skills that would have served him well under different circumstances. The young prince's earliest political experiences came during the family conflicts that dominated the 1170s and 1180s. Unlike his elder brothers, who rebelled against Henry II in pursuit of their assigned inheritances, John remained loyal to his father, earning rewards in the form of lands in Ireland and England. This loyalty was motivated partly by genuine affection, but primarily by calculation. As the youngest son, John understood that his future depended entirely on Henry's continued favour. John's first independent command came with his appointment as Lord of Ireland in 1177, when he was barely 11 years old, though initially only a titular position. This appointment would eventually provide John with valuable experience in colonial administration and military command. The Irish lordship also gave him his first taste of the enormous challenges involved in governing populations with different languages, customs, and legal traditions. The young prince's expedition to Ireland in 1185 represented both an opportunity to demonstrate his capabilities and a revealing preview of his future difficulties as a ruler. At 18, John possessed theoretical knowledge of governance, but lacked the practical experience and mature judgment necessary for successful leadership. His treatment of Irish chieftains, mocking their unfashionable dress and customs, a cultural insensitivity that would characterize his entire career. More seriously, John's failure to build effective alliances with either the Anglo-Norman settlers or the native Irish populations, revealed fundamental weaknesses in his political instincts. Unlike successful medieval rulers who understood the importance of balancing different interest groups, John tended to rely on a small circle of loyal supporters while treating potential allies as enemies to be subdued rather than partners to be cultivated. The death of Geoffrey of Brittany in 1186 and Henry the Young, king in 1183, gradually moved John closer to the succession, creating new opportunities but also new dangers. Richard's accession as heir apparent established a complex relationship between the brothers that would profoundly influence both their lives. While John publicly supported Richard's claim, he privately began building the networks and alliances that would enable him to challenge his brother, if circumstances permitted. John's behavior during Richard's crusading absence revealed both his ambitions and his limitations as a political operator. His attempts to undermine Richard's administrators, particularly William Longshanks, demonstrated considerable political skill and understanding of English noble grievances. His success in building a coalition against Longshanks showed that he possessed real abilities as a factional leader and political organizer. However, John's ultimate failure to seize power during Richard's absence also revealed critical weaknesses in his character and methods. His alliance with Philip Augustus of France, while strategically logical, violated fundamental feudal loyalties and branded him as a traitor in the eyes of many potential supporters. His inability to maintain consistent alliances and his tendency to abandon partners when immediate advantage beckoned would plague his entire career. The succession crisis following Richard's death in 1199 provided John with his greatest opportunity and his first major test as a leader. The choice between John and young Arthur of Brittany divided the Angevin territories along regional and political lines, with John receiving support from England and Normandy while Arthur was backed by Brittany, Anjou and Maine. More ominously, Philip Augustus threw his support behind Arthur, seeing an opportunity to fragment the Angevin Empire. John's initial success in securing the English crown and the loyalty of the Norman nobility demonstrated real political and military skills. His rapid movement between territories, his effective use of English resources, and his ability to outmaneuver his enemies showed that he had learned valuable lessons from his family's earlier conflicts. The Treaty of La Galette in 1200, which temporarily secured Philip's recognition of John's claims, represented a significant diplomatic achievement. John's marriage to Isabella of Angoulême in August 1200 exemplified both his strategic thinking and his talent for creating unnecessary enemies. The marriage gave John control of vital territory between Poitou and Gascony, potentially strengthening his position in southwestern France. However, Isabella's previous betrothal to Hugh de Lusignan created a powerful enemy whose grievances would provide Philip Augustus with the pretext for renewed warfare. The casual brutality with which John treated the Lusignan family revealed character flaws that would ultimately destroy him. Rather than attempting to negotiate compensation or find alternative arrangements, John imprisoned Hugh and his brothers, then subjected them to conditions so harsh that several died in captivity. This treatment violated medieval conventions about the treatment of noble prisoners and convinced many that John was fundamentally untrustworthy. The mysterious disappearance of Arthur of Brittany in 1203 marked a turning point in John's reign and reputation, while the exact circumstances of Arthur's death remain unknown. Contemporary chroniclers widely believed that John had murdered his nephew with his own hands. Whether or not this was true, the rumors surrounding Arthur's fate created a propaganda disaster that Philip Augustus exploited with devastating effectiveness. The collapse of John's French territories between 1202 and 1204 represented one of the most spectacular military disasters in medieval history. The Angevin Empire that Henry II had spent a lifetime building and that Richard had defended with legendary heroism crumbled with shocking speed as John proved incapable of maintaining the loyalty of his continental subjects or mounting effective resistance to French advances. The fall of Chateau Galliard in March 1204 symbolized the magnitude of John's failure. Richard's masterpiece of military architecture, designed to be impregnable and positioned to control access to Normandy, surrendered. After a siege that John made no serious attempt to relieve, the psychological impact of losing Richard's greatest achievement was almost as damaging as the strategic consequences of French control over the Seine Valley. John's retreat to England in 1204 marked the beginning of a new phase in his reign, characterized by desperate attempts to raise the resources necessary for reconquest and increasingly tyrannical methods of governing his remaining territories. The king who had lost an empire became obsessed with extracting every possible penny from his English subjects, leading to innovations in taxation and administration that would have profound constitutional consequences. The systematic extortion that characterized John's domestic policies revealed both his administrative capabilities and his complete lack of political judgment. His introduction of new forms of taxation, his manipulation of the legal system for financial gain, and his use of arbitrary fines and confiscations generated enormous revenues but destroyed the traditional relationships between crown and nobility that were essential for medieval governance. John's treatment of William de Braose, one of his most loyal supporters, demonstrated the extremes to which his paranoia and greed could lead. De Braose's refusal to pay an impossible debt of 40,000 marks resulted in the imprisonment and starvation of his wife and son, an act so shocking that it turned even John's supporters against him. The incident revealed that no one, regardless of past loyalty or service, was safe from John's suspicions and financial demands. The king's conflict with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury created another set of enemies and further isolated John from potential sources of support. The papal interdict imposed on England in 1208 suspended most church services throughout the kingdom, while John's excommunication in 1209 provided his enemies with moral authority for resistance and rebellion. John's response to the interdict demonstrated both his pragmatic abilities and his fundamental misunderstanding of medieval religious sensibilities. His seizure of church property and revenues, while financially profitable, convinced many of his subjects that he was fundamentally impious and possibly in league with Satan. His treatment of clergy who refused to cooperate, including the imprisonment of bishops and the confiscation of monastic wealth, created lasting resentment among powerful ecclesiastical interests. The years between 1208 and 1213 represented the nadir of John's reign, as he faced simultaneous threats from France, Scotland, Wales, and his own nobility while dealing with papal condemnation and popular unrest. His survival during this period owed more to the disunity of his enemies than to his own political skills, though his ability to manipulate competing interests and exploit temporary advantages showed that he retained considerable tactical abilities. John's submission to the Pope in 1213, which involved his surrender of England and Ireland as papal fiefs, represented both a diplomatic masterstroke and a humiliating acknowledgement of his weakness. The agreement secured papal support for his regime while providing protection against French invasion, but it also symbolized the extent to which John's authority had been diminished by his previous failures. The disastrous Battle of Bouvines in 1214 marked the final collapse of John's hopes for reconquering his French territories. His carefully planned coalition with Emperor Otto IV and the Count of Flanders was decisively defeated by Philip Augustus, leaving John isolated and facing the united opposition of his English barons. The battle's outcome demonstrated that John's strategic vision was sound, but that his execution of military and diplomatic plans remained fundamentally flawed. The baronial rebellion that erupted in 1215 was the inevitable result of years of accumulated grievances against John's arbitrary rule. The rebels, led by Robert Fitzwalter and styling themselves the Army of God and Holy Church, represented a coalition of northern barons, London merchants, and disaffected clergy united by their shared hatred of John's tyrannical methods. The negotiations at Runnymede in June 1215 produced the most important constitutional document in English history. Magna Carta represented not merely a peace treaty between John and his opponents, but a revolutionary attempt to establish legal limits on royal authority. Its 63 clauses addressed specific grievances, while establishing broader principles about the rule of law that would influence constitutional development for centuries. The specific provisions of Magna Carta revealed the extent of John's arbitrary behavior and the sophistication of baronial constitutional thinking. Clauses limiting the king's ability to demand excessive reliefs, regulating the treatment of widows, and establishing procedures for legal proceedings demonstrated that the rebels possessed a clear understanding of the legal reforms necessary to prevent future tyranny. More fundamentally, Magna Carta established the principle that even kings were subject to law and that royal authority must be exercised within legal boundaries. The famous clause 39, declaring that no free man should be imprisoned or dispossessed except by lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, created a legal foundation for what would eventually become the concept of due process. John's acceptance of Magna Carta was entirely tactical. He had no intention of abiding by its terms and immediately began seeking papal support for its annulment. His success in convincing Innocent III to declare the charter invalid demonstrated his continued diplomatic skills, but also ensured that the constitutional crisis would continue. The Pope's condemnation of Magna Carta as shameful and demeaning reflected the papal commitment to supporting legitimate royal authority against rebellious subjects. The outbreak of civil war in autumn 1215 plunged England into the most serious internal conflict since the anarchy of Stephen's reign. John's military campaigns during the First Barons' War revealed that he had learned valuable lessons from his earlier failures and possessed genuine abilities as a field commander. His rapid marches across England, his successful sieges of rebel strongholds, and his coordination of multiple military operations showed strategic and tactical skills that had been largely absent from his continental campaigns. The siege of Rochester Castle in November 1215 demonstrated both John's military capabilities and his understanding of psychological warfare. His systematic reduction of this supposedly impregnable fortress, achieved through innovative mining techniques and relentless pressure, broke the spirit of many rebels and proved that John could be formidable when fighting on familiar terrain. With adequate resources, John's devastating march through northern England in early 1216 revealed the darker side of his character and his willingness to use terror as a weapon of war. His deliberate destruction of rebel estates, his execution of prisoners, and his encouragement of his mercenary forces to pillage and burn created a trail of devastation that shocked even contemporary observers accustomed to medieval warfare's brutalities. The intervention of Prince Louis of France in 1216 transformed the rebellion from a domestic conflict into a foreign invasion, fundamentally changing the political dynamics of the war. Louis's claim to the English throne through his wife Blanche of Castile provided the rebels with an alternative king, while his military resources gave them the capability to challenge John's supremacy in southeastern England. John's response to the French invasion demonstrated both his continued energy and his growing desperation. His attempts to coordinate naval operations with land campaigns, his efforts to maintain control of key strategic points, and his recruitment of additional mercenary forces showed that he understood the magnitude of the threat he faced. However, his inability to inspire loyalty among his English subjects meant that his military advantages were gradually eroded by defections and passive resistance. The final campaign of John's life, conducted in the autumn of 1216, revealed a king who remained dangerous despite his weakened position. His march through the fenlands of East Anglia was designed to relieve rebel sieges, while maintaining communications with potential reinforcements from the continent. The supposed loss of his treasure in the Wash, whether true or legendary, symbolized the extent to which John's position had deteriorated. John's death from dysentery at Newark Castle on October 19, 1216, probably saved England from years of continued civil war and foreign occupation. His final weeks were marked by fever, delirium, and apparent recognition that his reign had been a failure. Contemporary chroniclers noted that he died unlamented by his subjects, and that few mourned his passing. The immediate aftermath of John's death demonstrated both the extent of his failure and the possibilities for recovery under different leadership. The accession of his 9-year-old son, Henry III, under the regency of William Marshal, immediately changed the political dynamics of the Civil War. The rebel support for Louis began to weaken as English nobles realized that they could achieve their constitutional objectives without foreign rule. The reissue of Magna Carta in 1216, with its most controversial clauses removed, represented the ultimate triumph of the constitutional principles that John had tried to suppress. The document's transformation from a failed peace treaty into the foundation of English constitutional law demonstrated that John's resistance to legal limits on royal power had been both futile and counterproductive. John's legacy was almost entirely negative, yet his failures proved transformative for English constitutional development. His loss of the French territories forced the Plantagenet dynasty to focus on England rather than continental adventures, ultimately strengthening English institutions and identity. His tyrannical methods provoked the constitutional revolution embodied in Magna Carta, establishing principles of limited government that would eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world. The king, who had been nicknamed Lackland, as a child died having lost virtually everything his family had built over the previous 60 years. Yet in losing so much, John inadvertently helped create something greater, the legal and constitutional foundations that would make England unique among European monarchies. His reign demonstrated that even the most capable administrative systems could not survive a ruler who lacked the wisdom to understand the limits of royal power. John Plantagenet was buried at Worcester Cathedral, having requested interment near the shrine of St. Wulfstan, perhaps hoping that proximity to this holy bishop might provide some posthumous redemption for a reign marked by cruelty, faithlessness, and ultimate failure. His tomb effigy, carved in Purbeck marble, presents an idealized image that bears little resemblance to the historical reality of one of England's most unsuccessful kings. The transformation of John from historical figure to literary villain began almost immediately after his death and was largely complete by Shakespeare's time. The contrast between the absent but heroic Richard and the usurping tyrant John provided perfect material for stories of resistance and hope for justice. These legends, while historically inaccurate, captured essential truths about John's character and the nature of his reign. Modern historical evaluation of John has been somewhat more sympathetic, recognizing his administrative abilities and the impossible strategic situation he inherited from Richard's failures. However, most historians continue to view his reign as fundamentally unsuccessful, marked by military incompetence, political miscalculation, and moral bankruptcy that made him unfit for the responsibilities of medieval kingship. Yet, John's ultimate historical significance lies not in his personal failings, but in the constitutional innovations that his tyranny provoked. Magna Carta, parliamentary development, and the principle of limited government all emerged from the crisis of his reign. The king, who tried to establish absolute royal authority, inadvertently created the legal foundations for constitutional monarchy and the rule of law. Edward, later known as Edward Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots, and one of medieval England's most formidable warrior kings, was born on June 17, 1239, at Westminster Palace during a period of unprecedented prosperity and cultural achievement. Under his father Henry III, unlike previous Plantagenet heirs who had inherited kingdoms torn by civil war or threatened by foreign invasion, Edward grew up in an England that was stable, wealthy, and increasingly confident of its place in European affairs. The future king's physical presence was remarkable even by the standards of an age that valued martial prowess above all other royal qualities. Contemporary chroniclers described Edward as standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, an exceptional height for the 13th century, with a powerful build, golden hair, and the kind of commanding presence that could silence a room with a single glance. His nickname Longshanks referred not only to his height, but also to the long, powerful stride that allowed him to cover enormous distances on foot during military campaigns. Edward's education was comprehensive and sophisticated, reflecting both the cultural achievements of Henry III's court and the growing complexity of medieval government. Unlike earlier Plantagenet princes, who had focused primarily on military training, Edward studied law, theology, literature, and the emerging sciences of the 13th century. His tutors included some of Europe's most distinguished scholars, while his education in practical governance was provided through direct participation in royal administration from an early age. The young prince's intellectual development was matched by intensive military training that prepared him for the role of warrior king the medieval society expected from its rulers. He learned not only individual combat skills, but also the complex arts of siege warfare, military engineering, and the logistics of moving and supplying large armies across vast distances. His understanding of contemporary military technology was exceptional, and he would later become one of Europe's leading innovators in castle design and siege techniques. Edward's first taste of real military command came during the baronial revolt, led by Simon de Montfort in the 1260s. Initially captured by the rebels at the Battle of Lewes in 1264, Edward's dramatic escape and subsequent victory at Evesham demonstrated both his personal courage and his emerging abilities as a military leader. His treatment of de Montfort's body after the battle dismembered and distributed as trophies revealed the ruthless streak that would characterize his entire career. The prince's participation in the Lord Edward's Crusade from 1270 to 1272 provided invaluable experience in international warfare and diplomacy. Unlike previous crusading ventures that had focused on large-scale military operations, Edward's expedition emphasized negotiation, alliance building, and the kind of limited military intervention that could achieve specific political objectives. His narrow escape from assassination in Acre demonstrated both the dangers of crusading and his remarkable physical resilience. Edward's accession to the throne in 1272 marked the beginning of a transformation in the nature of English kingship. Where his father, Henry III, had been primarily interested in art, architecture, and religious devotion, Edward embodied the martial ideals of medieval royalty. His coronation ceremony, conducted with unprecedented magnificence, established him as a king who would rule through strength rather than spiritual authority or administrative competence alone. The new king's domestic priorities focused on strengthening royal authority and systematizing the legal and administrative reforms that had begun under his predecessors. Edward's legal innovations were revolutionary in their scope and lasting in their impact. The Statutes of Westminster, enacted between 1275 and 1290, created a comprehensive legal framework that remained the foundation of English law for centuries. His establishment of professional legal education, standardization of court procedures, and codification of feudal obligations transformed England into Europe's most efficiently governed kingdom. Edward's understanding of the relationship between law and power was sophisticated and pragmatic. Unlike rulers who imposed their will through arbitrary force, Edward used legal reform to strengthen royal authority, while providing his subjects with predictable procedures and reliable justice. His creation of new legal remedies, expansion of royal court jurisdiction, and standardization of legal documentation made royal law more attractive than traditional feudal or ecclesiastical alternatives. The king's financial innovations were equally important for the long-term development of English government. Edward's systematization of taxation, his negotiation of regular parliamentary grants, and his development of new revenue sources created the fiscal foundation for England's emergence as a major European power. His understanding of the relationship between taxation and representation would have profound implications for constitutional development in later centuries. Edward's conquest of Wales represented both the culmination of centuries of English expansion and a demonstration of his revolutionary approach to military and political organization. Unlike previous English campaigns that had relied primarily on temporary expeditions and tributary relationships, Edward's Welsh wars were designed to achieve permanent conquest and complete integration of Wales into the English kingdom. The systematic nature of Edward's Welsh campaigns revealed his understanding of both military strategy and colonial administration. His construction of roads through the Welsh mountains, establishment of supply bases along the coast, and coordination of land and sea forces demonstrated logistical capabilities that far exceeded anything previously seen in medieval Europe. More importantly, his establishment of new towns, introduction of English legal procedures, and encouragement of English settlement created the administrative infrastructure necessary for permanent control. The death of Llywelyn ap Griffith in 1282 marked the end of Welsh independence, but Edward's response to this final act of resistance revealed the calculated brutality that earned him the title Hammer of the Scots. His execution of captured Welsh nobles, confiscation of their estates, and systematic destruction of Welsh cultural symbols demonstrated his understanding that conquest must be followed by policies designed to prevent future rebellion. Edward's construction of the great Welsh castles Carnarvon, Conway, Harlech, and Beaumaris represented both military innovation and symbolic domination. These fortifications incorporated lessons learned from Edward's crusading experiences while demonstrating the latest developments in castle design and siege warfare. More importantly, they served as administrative centers for the new English colonial government and symbols of permanent English authority. The birth of Edward's son at Carnarvon Castle in 1284 and his proclamation as Prince of Wales established a tradition that continues to this day, ensuring that the heir to the English throne would always bear the title of the conquered Welsh princes. This symbolic appropriation of Welsh royal dignity demonstrated Edward's sophisticated understanding of the psychological aspects of conquest and his determination to eliminate any possibility of future Welsh independence movements. Edward's Scottish campaigns represented both his greatest ambition and his ultimate failure as a conqueror. The crisis began in 1290 when the death of Margaret, the Maid of Norway, left Scotland without a clear heir to the throne. Edward's invitation to arbitrate the succession dispute seemed reasonable given his position as overlord of Scotland, but his subsequent treatment of John Balliol as a puppet king provoked the resistance that would define the remainder of his reign. The Scottish Wars of Independence that began in 1296 revealed both Edward's military genius and the limitations of medieval conquest. His initial invasion of Scotland was conducted with overwhelming force and systematic brutality designed to terrorize the Scots into permanent submission. The sack of Berwick-upon-Tweed, where Edward's forces killed virtually every inhabitant, demonstrated his willingness to use mass murder as an instrument of policy. Edward's establishment of English administration throughout Scotland, his removal of the Stone of Destiny to Westminster Abbey, and his appointment of English officials to govern Scottish territories demonstrated his intention to eliminate Scottish independence permanently. However, the continued resistance under William Wallace and later Robert the Bruce proved that no amount of violence could destroy Scottish determination to remain free. The execution of William Wallace in 1305 represented both a personal triumph for Edward and a propaganda disaster that strengthened Scottish resistance. Wallace's torture and dismemberment before a cheering London crowd was designed to terrorize other potential rebels, but instead it created a martyr whose example inspired continued resistance. Edward's inability to capture Robert the Bruce or eliminate Scottish resistance demonstrated the fundamental impossibility of his imperial ambitions. Edward's relationship with Parliament revealed his sophisticated understanding of the political realities of medieval governance. Unlike kings who saw parliamentary institutions as constraints on royal authority, Edward used Parliament as a tool for legitimizing his policies and securing financial support for his military campaigns. His famous declaration that what touches all should be approved by all established principles of consent that would have profound implications for future constitutional development. The model Parliament of 1295 represented the full development of Edward's parliamentary strategy by including representatives not only of the traditional estates but also of merchants, townspeople, and lower clergy. Edward created a broadly representative institution that could provide both political legitimacy and financial resources for his ambitious military campaigns. His ability to secure regular parliamentary grants while maintaining broad political support demonstrated political skills that few medieval rulers possessed. Edward's relationship with the Church revealed both his commitment to Orthodox Christianity and his determination to subordinate ecclesiastical authority to royal control. His Statute of Mortmain restricted the Church's ability to acquire new lands, while his taxation of ecclesiastical wealth for military purposes established precedents that would be followed by his successors. His diplomatic relations with successive popes demonstrated his understanding of the purportance of maintaining religious legitimacy while pursuing secular objectives. The king's treatment of England's Jewish population revealed the darker aspects of his character and the religious intolerance that characterized medieval Christian society. Edward's systematic extortion of Jewish wealth through arbitrary taxation and legal persecution culminated in the complete expulsion of England's Jewish community in 1290. This act of ethnic cleansing was popular with his Christian subjects, but demonstrated his willingness to destroy entire communities for political and financial advantage. Edward's personal life was marked by both genuine devotion and calculated political alliance. His marriage to Eleanor of Castile appears to have been a genuine love match that produced numerous children and lasted until Eleanor's death in 1290. The Eleanor crosses that Edward erected at every place where her funeral procession stopped. On its journey to Westminster Abbey, demonstrated both his personal grief and his understanding of the political importance of public ritual. Edward's second marriage to Margaret of France in 1299 represented a diplomatic alliance designed to secure his position during the Scottish Wars. Though Margaret was much younger than the aging king, the marriage produced additional heirs and helped secure French neutrality during Edward's northern campaigns. The king's ability to maintain successful personal relationships while pursuing ruthless political objectives demonstrated the complex personality behind his fearsome public image. The later years of Edward's reign were increasingly consumed by his futile attempts to complete the conquest of Scotland. Despite repeated military campaigns, massive expenditures, and increasingly desperate measures, Scottish resistance continued under Robert the Bruce's leadership. Edward's health began to fail, but his determination never wavered. He reportedly commanded that his bones be carried at the head of English armies until every Scot had submitted to English rule. Edward's death on July 7, 1307, while marching north for yet another Scottish campaign, symbolized both his unwavering commitment to his imperial vision and the ultimate impossibility of that vision's realization. His final words, commanding his son to continue the war until Scotland was completely subdued, demonstrated his inability to accept that some conquests were beyond even his considerable abilities. The immediate aftermath of Edward's death revealed both the extent of his achievements and the fragility of his legacy. His legal reforms had created the institutional framework for England's development into a major European power, while his military innovations had established England as the continent's premier military force. However, his Scottish wars had drained English resources and created enemies that would plague his successors for centuries. Edward Longshanks left behind a transformed England that was wealthier, more efficiently governed, and more militarily capable than ever before. His legal innovations had created the foundation of English common law, while his parliamentary innovations had established the precedents for representative government. His conquest of Wales had created the territorial foundation for future British unity, even as his Scottish wars had demonstrated the limitations of medieval imperialism. Yet Edward's legacy was fundamentally ambiguous. His achievements in law, administration, and military organization provided the foundation for England's later expansion throughout the world. However, his brutal methods and imperial ambitions also created patterns of conquest and colonization that would be repeated in Ireland, Scotland, and eventually in territories far beyond Europe. The hammer of the Scots died believing he had forged an empire that would endure forever. Instead, he had created the institutional and legal framework for a nation that would eventually spread its influence around the globe through means very different from simple military conquest. His combination of legal innovation, administrative efficiency, and military prowess provided the template for successful English expansion, even as his personal failures demonstrated the limitations of purely coercive approaches to empire building. Edward I's reign represented both the culmination of medieval English development and the foundation for England's emergence as a world power. His legal reforms created institutions that would be transplanted throughout the English-speaking world, while his military innovations established patterns of warfare that would influence English military development for centuries. Most importantly, his understanding of the relationship between consent and effective government established precedents that would eventually transform the nature of political authority itself. Edward, later known as Edward III, the father of English military glory, and the king who would transform his realm into medieval Europe's dominant power, was born on November 13th, 1312, at Windsor Castle during one of the darkest periods in Plantagenet history. His father, Edward II's reign had been marked by military humiliation, baronial rebellion, and the kind of personal failures that threatened the very survival of the dynasty. The young prince's birth offered hope for renewal, but few could have predicted that this child would become one of England's greatest kings. The circumstances of Edward's early life were shaped by the spectacular failure of his father's kingship and the violent revolution that brought him to the throne. Edward II's favoritism toward unpopular courtiers, his military incompetence in Scotland, and his estrangement from Queen Isabella had created a political crisis that threatened to destroy the Plantagenet dynasty entirely. The young prince grew up witnessing the gradual collapse of royal authority and the growing boldness of his father's enemies. Isabella of France, Edward's mother, was one of the most remarkable and controversial women of the medieval period. Known to history as the She-Wolf of France, Isabella possessed the intelligence, ambition, and ruthlessness that her husband so obviously lacked. Her decision to take Roger Mortimer as her lover and ally against Edward II demonstrated both her political desperation and her willingness to pursue any course that might save her son's inheritance. The invasion of England in 1326 by Isabella and Mortimer marked young Edward's first direct experience of political revolution and military conflict. Though only 14 years old, the prince was forced to play a central role in the overthrow of his own father, creating psychological scars that would influence his entire approach to kingship. The deposition and probable murder of Edward II provided valuable lessons about the consequences of weak leadership and the importance of maintaining noble support. Edward's coronation on February 1st, 1327, at Westminster Abbey was magnificent in its ceremonial splendor but hollow in its political reality. The 14-year-old king was merely a figurehead for the regency government of his mother and Mortimer, who ruled England in his name while pursuing their own agenda of revenge against their enemies and enrichment at the kingdom's expense. For 3 years, Edward chafed under this arrangement while learning valuable lessons about the exercise of power. The young king's education during this period was comprehensive and practical, focusing on the skills necessary for medieval kingship. Unlike his father, who had shown little interest in military matters, Edward received intensive training in warfare, strategy, and the practical aspects of leading armies in battle. His tutors included some of Europe's most experienced soldiers and administrators, while his exposure to the daily business of government provided invaluable preparation for his future role. Edward's physical development was remarkable, transforming him from a slight youth into the tall, powerful figure that would dominate European battlefields for half a century. Contemporary descriptions emphasize his commanding presence, his golden hair and beard, and the kind of natural charisma that his father had so obviously lacked. More importantly, Edward possessed the physical courage and martial skills that medieval society valued above all other qualities in its rulers. The coup against Mortimer in October 1330 demonstrated Edward's emerging political sophistication and his understanding of the dramatic gestures necessary to establish royal authority. His secret entry into Nottingham Castle, the capture of Mortimer, and the swift execution of his mother's lover marked the beginning of Edward's personal rule and his emergence as one of Europe's most formidable monarchs. Edward's first priority as an independent ruler was the restoration of royal dignity and the re-establishment of England's military reputation. The humiliating defeats suffered under his father, particularly the disaster at Bannockburn, had reduced England to a secondary power whose opinions carried little weight in European affairs. Edward's determination to reverse the situation would drive much of his domestic and foreign policy throughout his long reign. The Scottish campaigns of the early 1330s provided Edward with his first opportunity to demonstrate his military capabilities and to begin the process of restoring English prestige. His support for Edward Balliol's claim to the Scottish throne created the pretext for renewed English intervention, while his victories at Dublin Moor and Halidon Hill demonstrated that English military competence had been restored under new leadership. The Battle of Halidon Hill on July 19, 1333, marked the beginning of the military revolution that would make England the dominant European power for over a century. Edward's innovative use of dismounted men-at-arms, supported by massed longbowmen, created a tactical system that proved devastatingly effective against traditional cavalry charges. The complete destruction of the Scottish army at Halidon Hill sent shockwaves throughout Europe and established Edward as a military commander of exceptional ability. Edward's claim to the French throne, first asserted in 1337, represented both personal ambition and calculated political strategy. His hereditary claim through his mother Isabella was legally questionable, but politically useful, providing justification for the aggressive warfare that would characterize his reign. More importantly, the French claim offered opportunities for military glory and territorial expansion that could not be found in Britain alone. The early years of what would become known as the 100 Years' War demonstrated Edward's sophisticated understanding of both military strategy and international diplomacy. Rather than attempting immediate conquest of France, he pursued a strategy of alliance building with France's enemies while using England's growing wealth to finance devastating military campaigns that would weaken French power and enhance English prestige. Edward's marriage to Philippa of Hainault in 1328 represented both personal happiness and political calculation. Philippa brought not only beauty and intelligence to the English court, but also valuable continental connections that would prove crucial for Edward's military campaigns. More importantly, their relationship appears to have been genuinely affectionate, providing emotional stability that enabled Edward to pursue his ambitious foreign policy with confidence. The transformation of the English military under Edward III was revolutionary in both its methods and its results. His abandonment of traditional reliance on feudal levies in favor of contracted professional soldiers created armies that were more reliable, better trained, and more effectively equipped than their continental opponents. His systematic development of English archery, siege warfare capabilities, and naval power established England as Europe's premier military force. The great naval victory at Sluys on June 24, 1340, demonstrated England's emergence as a major maritime power and Edward's understanding of the strategic importance of controlling sea communications. The complete destruction of the French fleet not only secured English control of the Channel, but also demonstrated that English military superiority extended beyond land warfare to encompass naval operations as well. Edward's personal leadership during the Sluys campaign revealed the combination of tactical skill and personal courage that would characterize his entire military career. His decision to fight alongside his sailors, his innovative use of archers in naval combats, and his ability to maintain morale during the most desperate moments of the battle demonstrated the qualities that inspired absolute devotion among his followers. The Crusade campaign of 1346 represented the culmination of Edward's military innovations and the definitive demonstration of English tactical superiority. His march across northern France, culminating in the devastating victory at Crusade on August 26th, shocked medieval Europe and established new paradigms for military effectiveness that would influence warfare for centuries. The Battle of Crusade itself has been studied by military historians as one of the most significant tactical engagements in medieval history. Edward's defensive position, his coordination of archers and dismounted men at arms, and his ability to maintain discipline under extreme pressure created a tactical masterpiece that destroyed the cream of French chivalry. The sight of French knights charging repeatedly into storms of arrows that could penetrate armor at 200 yards revolutionized contemporary understanding of military capability. Edward's presence on the battlefield during the most critical moments of the engagement demonstrated the kind of personal leadership that medieval warfare demanded. His famous instruction to his commanders not to assist the Black Prince, who was fighting his first major battle, revealed both his confidence in his son's abilities and his understanding of the psychological importance of individual achievement in establishing military reputation. The siege of Calais that followed Crusade demonstrated Edward's understanding of the strategic importance of securing permanent bases for future operations. His methodical reduction of this vital port, achieved through one of the longest sieges in medieval history, provided England with a foothold in France that would be maintained for over 2 centuries. More importantly, the fall of Calais demonstrated Edward's ability to coordinate complex military operations over extended periods. The dramatic surrender of Calais, with its famous episode of the burghers offering their lives to save their city, revealed Edward's sophisticated understanding of the psychological aspects of warfare and political control. His apparent willingness to execute the city's leaders, followed by his theatrical clemency at Philippa's request, demonstrated both his ruthlessness and his appreciation for the political value of calculated mercy. The Black Death's arrival in England in 1348 forced a temporary halt to Edward's military campaigns, but provided an opportunity to consolidate his domestic achievements and strengthen the institutional foundations of English power. His response to the plague crisis demonstrated administrative competence and political sensitivity that enabled England to recover more quickly than its continental rivals. Edward's creation of the Order of the Garter, around 1348, institutionalized his Arthurian ideals and created a framework for binding the English nobility to his person through shared military glory and chivalric idealism. The Order's membership, limited to the king and 24 knights, represented the cream of English military leadership and provided a model for similar institutions throughout Europe. The resumption of major military operations in the 1350 South culminated in the Black Prince's stunning victory at Poitiers on September 19, 1356. This battle demonstrated that Edward's military innovations had been successfully transmitted to the next generation while achieving the ultimate symbol of military success, the capture of an enemy king. The sight of King John II of France being led into captivity in England represented the complete reversal of the military relationship between the two kingdoms. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 marked the high point of Edward's territorial achievements and demonstrated his willingness to accept practical gains rather than pursuing unrealistic objectives. His renunciation of his claim to the French throne in exchange for sovereignty over an enlarged Gascony and other territorial concessions revealed political wisdom that balanced ambition with realistic assessment of achievable goals. Edward's domestic achievements during the central years of his reign were as impressive as his military victories. His legal reforms, particularly his expansion of parliamentary institutions and his systematization of royal administration, created the governmental framework that would enable England to sustain its role as a major European power. His careful balance between royal authority and noble participation in government provided stability that lasted. Throughout his long reign, the development of Parliament during Edward's reign reflected both his political sophistication and his understanding of the relationship between taxation and representation. His regular consultation with parliamentary representatives, his careful explanation of his military and diplomatic policies, and his willingness to accept parliamentary oversight of royal expenditure created precedents that would fundamentally influence English constitutional development. Edward's patronage of learning and culture helped create the intellectual climate that would produce Geoffrey Chaucer, William Langland, and other writers who established English literature as a major European cultural force. His court became a center for artistic and intellectual achievement that rivaled Paris and other continental centers, while his encouragement of vernacular literature helped establish English as a language of high culture. The later years of Edward's reign were marked by military setbacks and domestic troubles that demonstrated the limitations of even his considerable abilities. The resumption of warfare with France in 1369, following the French repudiation of the Treaty of Bretigny, revealed that Edward's earlier victories had been tactical rather than strategic successes. The gradual loss of English territorial gains in France showed that conquest without the ability to maintain permanent control was ultimately meaningless. Edward's increasing dependence on his sons for military leadership reflected both his advancing age and the emergence of new French leadership under Charles V that proved more effective in resisting English pressure. The death of the Black Prince in 1376 deprived Edward of his ablest military commander and heir, creating succession problems that would plague the dynasty for generations. The Good Parliament of 1376 marked a watershed in English constitutional development and demonstrated the extent to which even Edward's popularity had been eroded by military failures and fiscal pressures. The Commons' impeachment of corrupt royal officials and their demands for governmental reform established precedents for parliamentary oversight that would constrain future royal authority. Edward's relationship with Alice Pers, his mistress, during his final years revealed the extent to which his judgment had been compromised by age and illness. Her influence over royal policy and her accumulation of wealth and privileges created scandals that undermined royal dignity and provided ammunition for Edward's critics in Parliament and among the nobility. The king's death, on June 21, 1377, at Sheen Palace marked the end of one of the most successful reigns in English history, but also the beginning of political crises that would ultimately destroy the Plantagenet dynasty. His failure to provide clear guidance for the succession, combined with the minority of his heir, Richard II, created opportunities for factional conflict that would dominate English politics for the remainder of the 14th century. Edward II's legacy was complex and often contradictory. His military victories had established England as Europe's premier power and created a tradition of military excellence that would influence English development for centuries. His legal and administrative reforms had strengthened royal government while expanding parliamentary participation in decision-making. His cultural patronage had helped establish English as a major European language and created literary traditions that would endure long after his political achievements had been forgotten. Yet Edward's achievements also contained the seeds of future disasters. His emphasis on military glory over domestic development created expectations that his successors could not maintain. His expansion of noble privileges and his creation of new duchies for his sons established competing power centers that would contribute to the civil wars of the following century. Most importantly, his failure to secure permanent control over his French conquests demonstrated the ultimate futility of purely military approaches to empire-building. The transformation of England under Edward III represented both the culmination of medieval military development and the foundation for England's emergence as a global power. His innovations in military organization, his development of parliamentary institutions, and his establishment of England as a major cultural center created the foundation for achievements that would extend far beyond medieval Europe. Edward III died believing he had restored English greatness and established his dynasty's permanent dominance over its rivals. While his immediate territorial conquests proved temporary, his institutional innovations and military traditions provided the foundation for English expansion that would eventually encompass much of the world. The warrior king who had sought glory through conquest of France inadvertently created the governmental and military traditions that would enable England to build a global empire through very different means. The reign of Edward III marked the transformation of England from a marginal European kingdom into a major continental power, while establishing the military, legal, and cultural traditions that would define English identity for centuries. His combination of personal charisma, military genius, and political sophistication created a model of successful kingship that would influence English and European development long after the Plantagenet dynasty had passed into history. The final century of Plantagenet rule began with the accession of 10-year-old Richard II in 1377, inheriting a kingdom that was militarily triumphant but politically unstable. The long reign of Edward III had created both unprecedented English power and internal contradictions that would ultimately destroy the dynasty he had done so much to glorify. The boy king who took the throne amid the splendor of Westminster Abbey would witness the beginning of the conflicts that would tear England apart for over a century. Richard, later known as Richard II, Richard of Bordeaux, and ultimately as one of England's most tragic monarchs, faced challenges that would have tested even the most experienced ruler. Born on January 6, 1367, in Bordeaux during the height of English power in France, Richard was the son of Edward the Black Prince and Joan of Kent. Inheriting both the military reputation of his father and the complex political legacy of the Plantagenet dynasty, the young king's early years were dominated by regency councils and the competing ambitions of his uncles, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, and Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester. These powerful nobles, each with their own territorial bases and political agendas, would shape Richard's understanding of royal authority and noble power in ways that would profoundly influence his approach to kingship. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 provided 14-year-old Richard with his first major test as a ruler and demonstrated both his personal courage and his understanding of the dramatic gestures necessary to maintain royal authority. His confrontation with Wat Tyler at Smithfield, his assumption of leadership after Tyler's death, and his promises to the rebels revealed political instincts that impressed even his critics. Richard's personal development during his teenage years was marked by increasing sophistication in artistic and cultural matters, but growing tension with the military nobility that had dominated his grandfather's court. Unlike Edward III, who had combined cultural patronage with military leadership, Richard showed little interest in warfare and preferred the company of scholars, artists, and foreign courtiers to that of English nobles. The king's court became one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated cultural centers, attracting poets, musicians, and artists from throughout the continent. Richard's patronage of Geoffrey Chaucer, his encouragement of vernacular literature, and his promotion of new artistic styles helped establish cultural traditions that would influence English development for centuries. However, his preference for cultural over military pursuits created tensions with nobles who expected their king to lead them in profitable foreign wars. Richard's marriage to Anne of Bohemia in 1382 demonstrated both his political sophistication and his growing independence from noble control. The alliance with the Holy Roman Empire provided valuable international support while introducing new cultural influences to the English court. Anne's intelligence and political acumen made her an effective partner in Richard's efforts to strengthen royal authority against noble encroachment. The crisis of 1386-1388 marked the first serious challenge to Richard's personal rule and revealed the depth of noble opposition to his policies. The Lords Appellant, led by his uncle Thomas of Woodstock, Richard Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, and Thomas de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, forced Richard to accept governmental restrictions and executed several of his closest advisors. This humiliation taught Richard valuable lessons about the importance of building independent power bases and the dangers of relying solely on traditional royal authority. Richard's recovery of power in 1389 demonstrated remarkable political skills, and his growing understanding of the complex relationship between royal authority and noble consent. His gradual rebuilding of royal influence, his careful cultivation of loyalist nobles, and his manipulation of factional rivalries showed that he had learned from his earlier defeats. For nearly a decade, Richard ruled effectively while planning his revenge against those who had humiliated him. The king's increasing interest in Ireland reflected both his understanding of the need for alternative sources of royal revenue and his recognition that successful military leadership might restore his credibility with the English nobility. His expedition to Ireland in 1394 to 1395 achieved remarkable success in pacifying the Anglo-Irish lordships and establishing effective royal authority throughout the island. Richard's development of new theories of royal authority during the 1390s represented both intellectual sophistication and practical response to the political challenges he faced. His adoption of imperial symbolism, his emphasis on the sacred nature of kingship, and his attempts to establish direct relationships with his subjects, bypassing noble intermediaries, reflected contemporary European trends toward more centralized monarchy. The death of Anne of Bohemia in 1394 marked a turning point in Richard's personality and political development. His grief at losing his beloved wife was genuine and profound, but his increasing isolation from English political society and his growing reliance on a small circle of favorites created vulnerabilities that his enemies would eventually exploit. Richard's second marriage to Isabella of Valois in 1396 represented both diplomatic triumph and political miscalculation. The alliance with France secured peace and provided opportunities for English trade and cultural exchange, but it also undermined Richard's support among nobles who profited from French wars and saw the French alliance as betrayal of English interests. The king's revenge against the Lords Appellant in 1397-1398 demonstrated both his long memory for injuries and his sophisticated understanding of legal procedures. His use of parliamentary impeachment, his manipulation of legal precedents, and his careful staging of trials and executions showed that Richard had become a formidable political operator. However, his execution of Arundel, his banishment of Warwick, and his mysterious murder of Gloucester revealed a vindictive streak that alienated potential supporters. The banishment of Henry Bullet, Duke of Hereford, in 1398 following his quarrel with Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, represented both Richard's attempt to eliminate potential threats and a fatal miscalculation about the loyalty of John of Gaunt's heir. Richard's confiscation of the Lancastrian inheritance following Gaunt's death in 1399 violated fundamental property rights and provided Bolingbroke with both motive and justification for rebellion. Henry's invasion of England in 1399, while Richard was campaigning in Ireland, demonstrated the fragility of even the most sophisticated royal authority when confronted by determined opposition. The rapid collapse of Richard's support, the defection of his armies, and his eventual capture revealed that his years of careful political construction could be undone by a single strategic miscalculation. The deposition of Richard II in September 1399 marked the end of the direct Plantagenet line and the beginning of the dynastic conflicts that would dominate English politics for the next century. Henry's usurpation, while successful in the short term, established precedents for the violent overthrow of legitimate authority that would ultimately destroy the stability Edward III had created. Henry, later known as Henry IV and the First Lancastrian king, faced immediate challenges that revealed both the advantages and disadvantages of gaining power through rebellion. His claim to the throne was based primarily on conquest rather than hereditary right, forcing him to maintain the coalition that had brought him to power while dealing with the legitimacy problems that would plague his entire reign. The mysterious death of Richard II in captivity at Pontefract Castle in early 1400 eliminated the immediate threat of restoration, but created a martyrdom that would inspire future rebellions. Whether Richard died of natural causes, committed suicide, or was murdered remains uncertain, but his death removed the possibility of peaceful resolution to the dynastic crisis and ensured that the Lancastrian usurpation would be contested by future generations. Henry's early reign was marked by constant rebellion and the need to prove his legitimacy through successful governance. The Epiphany Rising of 1400, Owen Glyndwr's rebellion in Wales, and the Percy family's revolts in northern England demonstrated that significant portions of the kingdom rejected Lancastrian rule and remained loyal to the memory of Richard II. The Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403 marked Henry's most serious military challenge and demonstrated both his personal courage and his understanding of the political stakes involved in maintaining his usurped authority. His defeat of the Percy Rebellion eliminated one major threat to his rule while establishing his credibility as a military leader capable of defending his crown through force of arms. Henry's relationship with Parliament reflected both his need for political support and his recognition that royal authority now required broader consent than had been necessary for previous monarchs. His regular consultation with parliamentary representatives, his acceptance of financial oversight, and his willingness to explain his policies created precedents that would fundamentally alter the relationship between Crown and Parliament. The king's mysterious illness during his later years, characterized by skin conditions and periodic incapacity, was interpreted by contemporaries as divine punishment for his usurpation of the throne. Whether these symptoms reflected psychological stress, specific diseases, or other factors, Henry's declining health created succession anxieties that added to the political instability of his reign. Henry's death in 1413 brought his son Henry V to the throne amid continuing challenges to Lancastrian legitimacy. The new king's decision to pursue aggressive war with France represented both personal ambition and calculated political strategy, designed to unite English nobles behind Lancastrian leadership while providing opportunities for military glory that might overshadow his dynasty's questionable origins. Henry, later known as Henry V, and England's greatest warrior king since Edward III, transformed the weakness of the Lancastrian position into aggressive strength through military conquest and diplomatic achievement. His victory at Agincourt in 1415 not only restored English military prestige, but also provided the legitimacy through success that the Lancastrian dynasty desperately needed. The systematic conquest of Normandy between 1417 and 1419 demonstrated Henry's sophisticated understanding of both military strategy and colonial administration. His establishment of English garrisons throughout Norman towns, his encouragement of English settlement, and his integration of Norman nobility into his administration created the foundation for permanent English control over French territory. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 represented the pinnacle of Lancastrian achievement and the apparent resolution of the succession crisis that had begun with Richard II's deposition. Henry's recognition as heir to the French throne, his marriage to Catherine of Valois, and his establishment of dual monarchy seemed to provide the ultimate legitimation for his family's rule over England. Henry's premature death in 1422 at the age of 35 created the very succession crisis that his achievements had been designed to prevent. The accession of 9-month-old Henry VI to both the English and French thrones placed impossible burdens on regency governments, while providing opportunities for ambitious nobles to pursue their own agendas. Henry, later known as Henry VI, and the most tragic figure in Plantagenet history, inherited crowns that required constant military and political leadership, but possessed neither the temperament nor the abilities necessary for effective rule. His gentle, scholarly nature and his periodic mental breakdowns created a power vacuum that would ultimately destroy the Lancastrian dynasty and plunge England into civil war. The gradual loss of English territories in France during Henry's minority and early personal rule reflected both the impossibility of maintaining Henry V's conquests and the growing effectiveness of French resistance under Charles VII and Joan of Arc. The final loss of all English territories, except Calais by 1453, marked the complete collapse of Plantagenet, imperial ambitions, and the end of English dreams of continental empire. The emergence of Richard, Duke of York, as the focal point for opposition. 2. Lancastrian rule reflected both his strong hereditary claim to the throne and his effectiveness as a political and military leader. His descent from Edward III through both paternal and maternal lines gave him arguably superior hereditary rights to Henry VI, while his administrative competence and military skills provided attractive alternatives to Lancastrian incompetence. The outbreak of civil war in 1455, with the First Battle of St. Albans, marked the beginning of the conflicts that would become known as the Wars of the Roses. The victory of York's forces and the capture of Henry VI demonstrated that the Lancastrian dynasty could no longer maintain its authority through traditional means, and that the succession question would ultimately be resolved through military force. The complex series of battles, alliances, and betrayals that characterized the Wars of the Roses between 1455 and 1487 represented both the culmination of Plantagenet family conflicts and the destruction of the political system that had sustained English monarchy for over 3 centuries. The rivalry between the houses of Lancaster and York tore apart the noble families that had provided the foundation for royal authority, while demonstrating the impossibility of resolving succession disputes through peaceful means. The death of Richard, Duke of York, at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460 seemed to end Yorkist hopes, but instead intensified the conflict by transferring leadership to his more capable and ruthless son, Edward. The young Earl's victory at Mortimer's Cross and his subsequent acclamation as Edward IV marked the beginning of the Yorkist restoration and the temporary eclipse of Lancastrian power. Edward, later known as Edward IV, and one of England's most successful warrior kings, demonstrated both the military genius of his Plantagenet heritage and the political skills necessary for establishing a new dynastic line. His decisive victory at Towton in 1461, fought in a blizzard that seemed to symbolize the darkness engulfing England, eliminated effective Lancastrian resistance and established Yorkist control over the kingdom. The relationship between Edward IV and Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, demonstrated both the importance of noble support for royal authority and the dangers of relying too heavily on overmighty subjects. Warwick's role in establishing Edward's power earned him the title Kingmaker, but his growing resentment at Edward's independence would ultimately lead to renewed civil war and the temporary restoration of Henry VI. Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville in 1464 represented both personal choice and political miscalculation that would have profound consequences for his dynasty. The elevation of Elizabeth's relatives to positions of power and wealth, created new factional tensions, while alienating Warwick and other nobles who had expected to benefit from Edward's gratitude for their earlier support. The rebellion of Warwick and George, Duke of Clarence, in 1469-1470, demonstrated the continuing instability of English politics and the impossibility of achieving permanent resolution to the succession crisis through military victory alone. Edward's temporary overthrow and flight to Burgundy showed that even the most successful Yorkist rule remained vulnerable to noble opposition and foreign intervention. Edward's dramatic return to England in 1471 and his victories at Barnet and Tewkesbury marked the final destruction of both Lancastrian hopes and Warwick's power. The deaths of Warwick, the Prince of Wales, and ultimately Henry VI himself eliminated the last credible alternatives to Yorkist rule while demonstrating Edward's ruthlessness in securing his dynasty's future. The 12 years of peace that followed Edward's restoration marked the most stable period England had enjoyed since Richard II's deposition in 1399. Edward's effective governance, his restoration of royal finances, and his success in maintaining noble loyalty demonstrated that the Yorkist dynasty had finally achieved the legitimacy and effectiveness that the Lancastrians had never fully established. Edward's sudden death in 1483 at the age of 40 precipitated the final crisis of the Plantagenet dynasty and demonstrated the continuing fragility of royal authority even under the most successful circumstances. The succession of 12-year-old Edward V created the power vacuum that Richard, Duke of Gloucester, would exploit to seize the throne for himself. Richard, later known as Richard III and the last Plantagenet king, represented both the culmination of the dynasty's achievements and the ultimate expression of its fatal flaws. His usurpation of his nephew's throne, his probable responsibility for the deaths of the princes in the Tower, and his defeat at Bosworth Field in 1485 marked the violent end of over 3 centuries of Plantagenet rule. The Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, represented both the final act of the Wars of the Roses and the beginning of a new era in English history. Richard's death in battle, the last English king to die fighting, ended the Plantagenet dynasty, but also resolved the succession crisis that had plagued England for nearly a century. Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth and his subsequent marriage to Elizabeth of York symbolically united the rival claims while establishing the Tudor dynasty on the foundation of Plantagenet destruction. The new king's adoption of the Tudor rose, combining the white rose of York with the red rose of Lancaster, represented both the end of dynastic conflict and the beginning of England's transformation into a modern nation-state. The legacy of the Wars of the Roses extended far beyond the immediate political consequences of dynastic change. The destruction of the old nobility, the strengthening of royal authority, and the establishment of new governmental institutions created the foundation for England's emergence as a major European power under the Tudors. The lessons learned from Plantagenet failures would guide English political development for centuries. The Plantagenet dynasty that had begun with Henry II's energy and ambition ended with Richard III's death in a muddy field in Leicestershire. Yet the institutional, legal, and cultural achievements of over 3 centuries of Plantagenet rule provided the foundation for everything that would follow. Their creation of English common law, their development of parliamentary institutions, and their establishment of England as a major European power created the framework for achievements that would extend far beyond medieval Europe. The story of the Plantagenets represents both the greatest achievements and the ultimate limitations of medieval monarchy. Their combination of military prowess, legal innovation, and cultural patronage created some of the finest achievements of medieval civilization. while their family conflicts and dynastic wars demonstrated the impossibility of resolving political disputes through purely personal relationships, as sleep gently carries you away. Remember these kings who created England through their triumphs and their tragedies. From Henry II's legal reforms to Richard III's final charge at Bosworth, the Plantagenet dynasty shaped a nation and influenced the world in ways that continue to this day. Their legacy lives on in the institutions they created, the laws they established, and the very idea of England itself. Let the rise and fall of this remarkable dynasty carry you into peaceful dreams of a time when kings could change the world through force of will alone, when a single battle could determine the fate of nations, and when the blood of kings flowed freely in pursuit of crowns that proved as fragile as the lives that wore them. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the pageantry and passion of England's greatest and most tragic royal house.